The chair scraped against the marble floor when I stood up, and every head at the table turned toward me. My father didn't flinch. He just looked at me the way he always had, like I was a problem he'd decided to stop solving. "I think it's better if you go," he said, quietly. That was the worst part. Not the words, but how little effort he put into them. I had driven 4 hours to get here. I had pressed my blouse twice because the first time left a crease I didn't like. I had stood in the parking lot of the Whitmore Club for 11 minutes before I walked through the door, telling myself this time would be different. That 70 years was enough time for a man to soften, that a milestone birthday might crack something open in him that decades of ordinary days hadn't. I picked up my clutch from the chair. My hands were steady. I was proud of that. I had almost made it to the edge of the private dining room when I heard him speak again, not to me, but to the table. To the 40-something guests seated around white linen and crystal stemware and the kind of floral centerpieces my stepmother ordered from a boutique in Georgetown. "She's always had a flair for the dramatic," he said, and several people laughed, the careful laugh of people who aren't sure they should be laughing. I stopped walking, not because of what he said. I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life. I stopped because of the man sitting at the far end of the second table, a man I didn't recognize, who was not laughing, who was staring at me with an expression I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't the polite discomfort of a guest witnessing a family disagreement. It was something else entirely. I looked away. I kept walking. The coat check was near the front entrance, past a corridor of framed photographs my stepmother had commissioned the family at their beach house in the Outer Banks. My father shaking hands with a senator, my sister Diane at her bat mitzvah, even though she wasn't Jewish, just liked the party. I wasn't in any of them. I had noticed that when I arrived, and I had decided not to let it mean anything. I was reaching for my coat when I heard footsteps behind me. I assumed it was Diane. She was the one who had called me 3 weeks ago and asked me to come. She was the one who had said, "Dad isn't going to live forever, Claire. Can't you just," and then paused in that particular way she had, like she was editing herself. "Can't you just be normal? Can't you just let it go? Can't you just make this easier for everyone?" But it wasn't Diane. "Excuse me." I turned. It was the man from the second table. Up close, he was older than I'd estimated, mid-60s, silver at the temples, a dark suit that fit the way expensive suits fit, like it had been made with him in mind. He was holding a glass of water and he looked slightly breathless, like he had walked faster than he intended. "I'm sorry to." He stopped. "You're Dr. Claire Ashworth." It wasn't a question. I looked at him carefully. "I am Walter Gaines," he said, and extended his hand. "My wife is Renee Gaines. We're friends of I believe your stepmother and Renee volunteer together at the Botanical Garden." He paused. "I don't think we've ever actually met." "I don't think so either," I said. He nodded slowly, like he was working something out. "I was at Mercy General," he said. "February, 4 years ago. I came in by ambulance." He stopped again, and this time it was different. His jaw moved. I coded twice in the ER. "And there was a doctor who." He looked at me. "You were the attending." I remembered. Not his face. I rarely remembered faces from those hours. The face was never the thing I was focused on, but I remembered the case. Male, 62, blunt abdominal trauma from a car accident on the I-270, ruptured spleen, internal hemorrhage that had been worse than the initial scan suggested. I had been on hour 19 of a 24-hour shift. I had not had coffee in 6 hours because there hadn't been time. "I remember the case," I said. "My daughter was 12, he said. "She's 16 now." He was quiet for a moment. I just wanted to say that. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't diminish it. He looked back toward the dining room, then at me. "Are you leaving?" "Yes." He nodded again. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but he was a man who had learned to choose his words. "Your father," he started. "It's fine," I said. "I've known Richard for Renee has known your stepmother for years, so I've been at a handful of these things." He looked at the photographs on the wall. "He talks about his daughters quite a bit. I had a feeling I knew exactly how my father talked about his daughters. He talks about Diane's work at the foundation," Walter Gaines said. "Her home in McLean. Her children." He paused. "He mentions you less." "He mentions me accurately," I said. "He just doesn't know the accurate version of me." Walter Gaines looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, Would you come back inside? I'd like to say something. Mr. Gaines. Walter. I shook my head. I appreciate it. I genuinely do. But this isn't the place, and it isn't the time, and whatever you want to say won't change anything that matters. Maybe not, he said. But I've been sitting at that table for an hour listening to your father tell Gerald Whitmore that his younger daughter is drifting. That's the word he used. Drifting. He looked at me steadily. You are a level 1 trauma surgeon, Dr. Ashworth. I would like the opportunity to say that out loud in a room where your father is present. I had not cried since I pulled into the parking lot of the Whitmore Club and sat in my car for 11 minutes. I had not cried on the drive up, or when I'd packed, or when I'd called Diane back and said yes. I had been doing very well. Give me a minute, I said. I did not go back to the dining room right away. I went to the restroom at the end of the corridor and stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists and looked at myself in the mirror until I felt like myself again. The person in the mirror was 32 years old. She had completed a general surgery residency at Johns Hopkins. She had done a trauma fellowship at the R. Adams Cowley Shock Trauma Center, which was, by most measures, the best trauma facility in the country. She had been the youngest attending in her department when she was hired. She had worked a 100-hour week more times than she could count, and she had called families into small beige rooms and told them things no family wants to hear, and she had also told families things that made grown men press their hands over their mouths and turn away from her so she wouldn't see them cry. She had driven 4 hours to watch her father tell Gerald Whitmore she was drifting. I turned off the water. I dried my hands. I walked back down the corridor. The dining room was mid-conversation when I came back through the door. My father was at the center of the head table, talking to the man on his left, Gerald Whitmore. I assumed older, white-haired, the look of someone who had been wealthy long enough that it had become unremarkable. My stepmother Patricia was speaking to Renee Gaines 3 seats down. Diane caught my eye from across the room and her expression shifted relief, then caution, then something that might have been hope. I took my seat. The woman next to me, one of Patricia's friends, I didn't know her name, smiled politely and returned to her salad. My father noticed me when the appetizer plates were being cleared. He looked at me the way you look at something that has moved without your permission. Claire, he said. Just the name, nothing attached to it. Happy birthday, Dad, I said. He turned back to Gerald Whitmore. It had been like this for a long time. Not always. There was a period I was maybe 7, 8, when I was the one he brought to his office on Saturdays. He'd put me in his chair and spin me around and let me use the tape dispenser, which felt like operating heavy machinery. He called me his little shadow. I don't know exactly when that stopped. What I know is that when I was 17 and told him I wanted to go into medicine, he looked at me across the dinner table with an expression that I had spent years trying to correctly identify. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to disappointment, which is worse, because disappointment implies expectation, and expectation implies that at some point he had believed in something. There's no future in medicine, he said. Do you know what malpractice insurance costs now? He said it like the conversation was already over, like we were discussing the weather, and the weather had been decided. I went into medicine anyway. I took out loans my father didn't know about, and I worked nights at a diner in Baltimore to cover what the loans didn't, and I did not tell him about any of it because he had made it clear, in the methodical way he made most things clear, that his involvement was conditional on my compliance. I hadn't chosen compliance, so I hadn't gotten involvement. He didn't come to my medical school graduation. He sent a card with a check for $200 and a line that said, "Hope this helps with whatever comes next." I still have the card somewhere. I'm not sure why I kept it. Over the years, Diane had tried to update him. She told me once, about 3 years in, that she'd mentioned to him I was doing a residency at Hopkins. He had said, "Hopkins, Maryland," like there was another Hopkins, like he was buying time. After that, I stopped asking Diane to update him. What was the point? He had a version of me in his mind, the daughter who chose wrong, who was probably struggling, who would probably come around eventually and admit that he'd been right, and that version was more useful to him than the real one. It let him maintain something. A story about himself as a man who knew better. The main course arrived. Filet mignon and roasted vegetables and a potato gratin that had clearly been made by someone who cared about it. I ate because I hadn't eaten since morning, and because sitting at a table not eating is its own kind of performance. My father gave a toast. He thanked Patricia, thanked Diane, thanked Gerald Whitmore for coming all the way from Annapolis, thanked several other people by name. He made a joke about turning 70 that got a genuine laugh. He was charming when he chose to be. I had always known that about him. It was the choosing that was the thing. He did not mention me. Diane looked at her plate. Patricia looked at my father. I refilled my water glass. After the toast, the volume in the room lifted again, and the particular intimacy of a large gathering returned. Everyone folded back into their own conversations, the way a crowd closes after someone passes through it. The woman next to me had opinions about a renovation project, and she shared them. I listened and responded in the appropriate places, and the whole time I was aware of Walter Gaines 2 tables over, sitting with Renee and not quite participating in the conversation happening around him. He had said he wanted to say something. I wasn't sure what I wanted. I was 32 years old and I had driven 4 hours, and my father had told me to leave and then told a room full of people I was dramatic. And I had come back inside anyway, and I wasn't sure if that was strength or stubbornness, or simply the inability to let go of something that no longer had any use for me. The dessert came. Chocolate torte? Patricia's choice. She had always liked chocolate. My father was telling a story to the table. I recognized the shape of it before I heard the content. Expansive, well-paced, building toward a punchline. He was a good storyteller. I had gotten that from him, probably. It was a strange thing to inherit. And that's when Richard turned to me and said, "Excuse me." Walter Gaines had stood up. The table closest to him went quiet first. Then the ripple moved outward, the way it does when someone stands unexpectedly at a seated dinner. By the time he had taken 2 steps toward the center of the room, most of the 40-some guests were looking at him. My father stopped mid-sentence. "I apologize for interrupting," Walter said. He had the voice of a man who had run meetings for decades, unhurried, clear, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard. "I'll be brief." My father's expression was politely puzzled. "Walter, 4 years ago," Walter said, "I was in a car accident on the interstate. I was 62 years old and my heart stopped twice in the emergency room, and the doctors told my wife to prepare herself." He paused. There was a surgeon who didn't agree with that outcome. The room was very quiet. She had been on shift for 19 hours. I know that because I asked, later, when I was well enough to ask. He looked across the room at me. She didn't know me. I was nobody to her. I was a chart, a set of vitals, a problem that needed solving. She solved it. He paused. "My daughter is 16 years old. She is a sophomore in high school. She's going to apply to colleges next year, and I'm going to sit across from her when she gets her acceptance letters, and I'm going to be there for it because of the surgeon who stayed in that operating room until the job was done." He looked at my father. "Her name is Dr. Claire Ashworth. She is sitting at your table, Richard. She is your daughter." Nobody moved. My father looked at Walter Gaines. Then he looked at me. His face did something I had never seen it do before. It moved through several expressions too quickly for any of them to fully form. It ended somewhere I couldn't name. "She's a trauma surgeon at Shock Trauma in Baltimore," Walter continued. And now his voice was quieter, almost gentle, but not quite. "It is one of the finest trauma centers in the world. I looked it up after, because I wanted to understand what kind of place produces someone like her." He stopped. "I just thought you should know that." He sat back down. The silence lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5. Then Gerald Whitmore said, quietly, "Good Lord." Diane was looking at her water glass. Her hands were flat on the tablecloth. I could see the effort in her stillness. Patricia said nothing. She was looking at her husband. My father was looking at me. I didn't know what to do with his expression. I had imagined versions of this moment, not this specific moment, because I had never engineered anything, had never planned a reveal or timed an entrance or practiced what I would say when the truth finally filled a room I was standing in. But I had imagined, in the vague way you imagine things you've stopped expecting, what it might look like if he ever actually saw me. If the version of me in his mind got replaced by the real one, I had thought it might feel like winning. It didn't feel like winning. He looked older than he had looked an hour ago. That's the only way I can describe it. Like something had shifted in how he was holding himself. "Claire," he said. His voice came out differently than usual. Not softer exactly, more uncertain. "You don't have to say anything," I said. Not right now. I didn't, he stopped. I didn't know you were at shock trauma. You didn't ask, I said. It wasn't an accusation. I wasn't angry, or I was, probably, somewhere underneath everything. But it wasn't what I felt most. What I felt most was tired. The particular exhaustion of carrying something heavy for a long time and finally being allowed to set it down, and discovering that setting it down doesn't actually fix anything, just changes the quality of the ache. No, he said. I didn't. Diane made a small sound. I looked at her, and she was pressing her fingers against her mouth. I thought about what I had decided, in the restroom, standing at the sink. I had decided something. I had decided to stop letting him have the version of me that didn't exist. The drifting daughter who had made the wrong choice and was quietly regretting it somewhere he didn't have to look at. That version had never been mine to give him. But I had been letting him keep it because taking it back required coming back. And coming back required exactly this. I stood up. Not to leave, I had already left once, and I had come back, and I was done performing exits. I stood up because I wanted to be standing for what I was about to say. I want to tell you something, I said. And I want to say it here, with everyone, because I'm done saying things only when we're alone, and you can decide later that you remember it differently. My father was still watching me. He had gone very still. I'm not angry at you, I said. I've been angry. For a long time, honestly. But I drove here today because I'm 32 years old and I have been at bedsides when people are dying, and what I have learned from that, the one thing I have learned that I can't unfeel, is that most people, at the end, are not thinking about the things they did. They're thinking about the things they didn't do. I paused. I didn't want to be at your bedside someday wishing I had come to your 70th birthday. He blinked. That's why I'm here, I said. Not because I need you to know what I've accomplished, not because I needed a room full of people to find out. I'm here because you're my father, and I have spent a long time waiting for that to count for something on your end, and I'm ready to stop waiting and just let it count on mine. The woman next to me had stopped breathing. I was fairly sure. I don't want an apology tonight, I said. I'm not asking for one. But if you want to know who I am, actually know you have my number. You've had it for years. It's the same number. I looked at him. I hope you had a good birthday, Dad. I mean that. I reached for my clutch. Diane said, Claire, I'll call you tomorrow, I said. And I meant it. I would call her. She had tried. She had always tried, in the careful way of someone who loves two people who have broken something between them and can't figure out which pieces belong to which side. I walked past the second table. Walter Gaines looked up at me as I passed. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. I put my hand briefly on his shoulder, not long. Just a second, and then I kept walking. My coat was where I'd left it, draped over the coat check counter because the attendant had gone somewhere when I'd been in the restroom and I hadn't wanted to wait. I put it on in the corridor. In the photographs on the wall, my father shook hands with the senator. My stepmother smiled at a gala. Diane posed with her children on a dock somewhere sunny. I looked at them while I buttoned my coat. I wasn't in any of them. I thought about what Walter Gaines had said, that his daughter was 16 and going to apply to college and he was going to be there for it. Something about that specific detail, the college letters, the kitchen table, the ordinary, irreplaceable weight of being present had lodged somewhere in my chest when he said it and hadn't moved. I thought about the patient I'd had the week before. 44 years old, MVA, golden hour, and we'd made it. Barely. She had a husband who had sat in the waiting room for 6 hours with their 8-year-old daughter asleep across his lap. When I came out to tell him she was stable, he had looked at me like I was something he couldn't put into words, and I had thought not for the first time that this was the thing. This was the exchange. You give the hours and the sleep deprivation and the weight of every outcome you couldn't control, and what you get back is that look, that specific look, from the husband with the sleeping daughter. It was enough. It had always been enough. I had just, somewhere along the way, let myself believe that it should also come with my father's approval, that I could have the work and the meaning and also the version of him that said, I'm proud of you without being prompted. You can want 2 things at once and only get one of them. That's not tragedy. That's just life, arranged the way it usually is. The front door of the Whitmore Club was heavy and opened onto a December night that had dropped another 5 degrees since I'd arrived. I stood on the steps for a moment. The parking lot was lit with those amber lights that make everything look warmer than it is. I heard the door behind me. I assumed it was the coat check attendant, returned. I didn't turn around. Claire. I turned around. My father was standing at the top of the steps. He didn't have his coat. He had come out in his dinner jacket into December, which meant he had come out quickly, which meant something. We looked at each other. I didn't know you were, he stopped. He tried again. I had no idea that stopped too. He was not a man who ran out of words. In 40 years of watching him, I had never seen him run out of words. You don't have to, I said. I want to. His voice was rougher than usual. I want to say something. I'm finding that I don't have the right, he exhaled. His breath was visible in the cold. I've been telling people you were drifting. I know. I believed it, he said. I had built up an idea of what was happening with you, and I had been holding on to it, and I didn't. He stopped. That's not an excuse. No, I said. It isn't. He nodded. He wasn't looking for absolution, I realized. That was new. My father was a man who had always moved quickly through guilt, acknowledged it briefly, and then restructured the narrative until he was back on solid ground. He wasn't doing that. He was just standing in the cold in his dinner jacket, looking at his daughter, and not trying to get back on solid ground. I don't know very much about you, he said. I've known that for a while. I didn't want to know it. I'm aware. You're 32. Yes. And you work at Walter, said Shock Trauma. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Do you like it? The work? It was such a strange question. It was the kind of question you ask someone you've just met, at a party, when you're trying to be polite. It was also, I realized, the first time he had ever asked me a question about medicine that was not rhetorical. That was not a setup for why I had made the wrong choice. I love it, I said. It's brutal, and it's relentless, and half the time I'm running on no sleep and bad coffee, and I love it completely. He looked at me for a long moment. That's how I felt about the business, he said quietly. When I was starting out. Before it became, he shrugged slightly, before it became something else. I hadn't known that. Or maybe I had known it somewhere and never connected it. The version of my father I carried was the finished version, the established man, the one with the opinions and the expectations and the disappointment, not the young one, running on no sleep and bad coffee, loving something completely. I should go in, he said. You should, he gestured toward the parking lot. Yes. He started to turn back toward the door. Then he stopped. Claire. He didn't look at me. I would like to, if you were willing, I would like to call you. Not tonight, but this week. If you're willing. I thought about saying no. I had every reason to say no, and no one who had been paying attention would have blamed me. I also thought about the waiting room husband, the sleeping daughter, the look on his face when I came through the doors. Same number, I said. It hasn't changed. He nodded once. He went back inside. I walked to my car. The drive home took 4 hours and 20 minutes because there was construction on the I-70 that hadn't been there on the way up. I listened to the radio for a while and then turned it off and drove in silence. At some point after midnight, somewhere in the long dark stretch between Frederick and Baltimore, it started to snow just lightly, the kind that doesn't accumulate, that only shows up in your headlights and disappears. He might not call. I knew that. I knew what it was to want to be better and still not make it to the phone. People decided to change in specific emotional moments and then went home and made dinner and went to sleep and woke up inside the same life they'd always had, because change is not a moment, it's a direction, and directions require sustained effort that moments don't prepare you for. He might call. I pulled off at a rest stop outside of Baltimore and sat in the parking lot with the engine running, and I let myself feel it, the whole thing, all of it. The 4-hour drive, and the coat check, and Walter Gaines and the photograph corridor, and my father on the steps in December without his coat. The thing I'd been holding carefully in place all night, managing, compartmentalizing, the way you learn to do when you work in a field where things are always on the edge of catastrophe and someone has to stay level-headed. I sat in the parking lot and let it move through me. Then I pulled back onto the highway and drove home to Baltimore. My apartment was quiet and cold the way apartments get when you've been away for most of the day. I turned on the heat. I changed out of my blouse. I made tea because it was too late for coffee, and I had an early shift. I had a trauma bay to be in at 7 in the morning, and a team that expected me, and somewhere between Baltimore and Bethesda, there were people who would need someone with steady hands and a willingness to stay in the room until the job was done. I drank my tea by the window. Outside, the snow had stopped. The streets were wet and orange under the streetlights, and the city made its usual sounds: traffic, distance, the low ambient hum of a place that never fully went to sleep. I thought about Walter Gaines's daughter, 16 years old, college applications coming. He would be there for it. I thought, that's what it's for. Not the approval, not the dinner table reveal, not any of it. The work was what it was for the hours and the wait and the ordinary, extraordinary act of being in the room when someone needed someone to be in the room. I finished my tea. I set the mug in the sink. I went to bed. My phone was on the nightstand. I looked at it once before I turned off the light. The same number it had always been. The one that hadn't changed. I closed my eyes. Whatever came next would come next. I had done what I came to do. I had come back when I could have kept driving, and I had said what needed to be said, and I had left without burning anything down. That was its own kind of strength, I had decided. Not the loudest kind. Not the kind that anyone necessarily sees, but the kind that gets you home,